all that we need to learn from the things that are being discussed tonight, because it couldn't come at a more appropriate time with all the struggles that we're involved with right now around the water and the land, and that we each remember that when we speak about reconciling, we're not talking about reconciling two equals. We do live in a colonial time and people, and that's what we'll be addressing hopefully tonight. So I welcome our sister Kim TallBear for whatever she has to say, and we're all really looking forward to what we have to share, because the closer we come to recognizing that we are all one, then the better off we'll be. So I don't want to take up too much time. I'm looking forward to it as much as everyone else is. And what an incredible turnout for an event like this. So, Walalio, Umsit Nuguma, and Matakuyasan. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking Elder Billy for his land acknowledgement, and I'd also like to acknowledge the other elders who are here tonight. We're deeply honored that you are here with us at King's. Thank you for being here. My name is Bill Leahy, and it's my pleasure as the president of the University of King's College to welcome you all to this evening's lecture. And I want to thank you all for deciding to spend your evening with us and with each other. And as Elder Billy mentioned, there are many people here in this auditorium, but there are many more of you here tonight than are in this auditorium. We have 2 other rooms of people watching this lecture tonight, so it's a fantastic turnout. On behalf of the university, I would also like to do a land acknowledgement. I do it with a particular kind of humility, knowing that I do it after Elder Billy. But I would like to acknowledge on behalf of the university that this lecture takes place on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I would also like to acknowledge that I live, and that we all live, and King's sits on these lands by the continuing authority of the treaties by which the Mi'kmaq and the British Crown agreed to live together in peace and friendship. In offering this acknowledgement, I worry, like many others I think who find themselves in the position of doing this, about these land acknowledgements becoming an empty formality. So I therefore ask everyone who is not Mi'kmaq to think deeply with our heads and our hearts as we listen to tonight's lecture about what it means to acknowledge that we live on someone else's land, and to mean it when we say it. Picking up on the note that Elder Billy also already sounded, based on my listening of an interview by Dr. TallBear this morning on the radio, I think this lecture gives us a perfect opportunity to do that, to really mean what we say when we acknowledge Mi'kmaq land. I think this lecture will give us much to think about that goes directly to what it means to not only acknowledge, but to believe and understand what it means to acknowledge that we live on unceded Mi'kmaq land under those treaties that are still very much alive and well, and indeed they're the constitutional foundation of the society that we live in. So having said all that, I acknowledge that this lecture takes place on unceded, unsurrendered Mi'kmaq land. I would like to acknowledge and thank our partners in organizing this lecture, the College of Sustainability at Dalhousie University, where many King's students major, minor, or take courses, and where I happen to be cross-appointed as a member of faculty, which, thank you for that continuing relationship. And I want to thank all the Dalhousie students who are here. I know there would be many Dalhousie students here in any event, but there are many Dalhousie students here because they are students in the College of Sustainability. The purpose of the annual MacLennan Lecture at the University of King's College is to offer students, faculty, researchers, and the public unique opportunities to learn about and discuss pressing issues in science and medicine with some of today's most innovative historians and philosophers of science. Each year, our lecturer spends time at King's as a visiting scholar, giving our students and faculty, as well as the students and faculty of Dalhousie and other universities, the opportunity to spend time with our lecturer in a seminar setting. So we've been delighted this week to have Dr. Kim TallBear with us as our MacLennan lecturer and visiting scholar for 2020. On behalf of King's College, I want to recognize and thank Oriole MacLennan for her generosity and vision in funding this lecture by a visiting scholar who spends time with our students. And in particular, I want to thank her for the emphasis on our visitors spending time with the students. Oriole is a lifelong enthusiast of the history of science, and we are deeply grateful that she is giving expression to that enthusiasm by sharing it with others, including those who study the history of science and technology at King's. So Oriole is here, but I know she would not want me to draw attention to her. So without my drawing attention to her, I'm going to ask you all to give Oriole MacLennan a round of applause. I would now like to call upon my colleague, Dr. Gordon McHewitt, the Director of the History of Science and Technology program here at King's, to introduce our lecturer. Enjoy the lecture. Thank you for being here.
And just to reiterate, on behalf of King's College, the College of Sustainability and the History of Science and Technology program, thank you all for crowding in to hear Dr. Kim TallBear speak today, and also to the water protectors and elders that have come to watch this talk. For those of you that are online or watching from the overflow rooms, we are live streaming this, and people across the province are watching it. I want to, where's the camera? Hi. Too bad you couldn't be in here. We're live streaming it, and and in the other rooms, and there'll be a chance to ask questions in the chat section of the live streaming site. You'll have to log on and give your private information and your blood type and all that stuff. And our students' assistants will relay our questions during the question period. Now, Dr. TallBear has been here for almost a week and engaging in a whole pile of different things. Our partners in Dalhousie and in the various programs and in our department and other programs here at King's College have found this incredibly profitable and found new ways to relate and translate and listen and learn. But the main thanks, Dr. Leahy gave thanks to all of our partners on this, but the real main thanks goes to Dr. TallBear, who has taken so much of her very busy, almost incomprehensibly busy schedule to be with us here this week. And that's why you're here, and that's her phone going off. Another appointment. Dr. Kim TallBear. Dr. Kim TallBear is an associate professor and faculty of Native Studies, University of Alberta, and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Peoples, Technoscience and Environment. She is also the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation Fellow, which must go over very well in Alberta. All right? It's like... Dr. TallBear is a tribal citizen of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate. Is Oyate right? I got it almost right. In South Dakota, and raised on the Flandreau Santee Sioux Reservation in South Dakota and in St. Paul, Minnesota, by your mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. Dr. TallBear originally trained at MIT and UMass in Boston, becoming a community and environmental planner with national tribe organizations focusing on environmental issues and politics. But soon her interest turned, as anybody would, to the cultures and politics of science and technology, and especially their implications for Indigenous peoples. Heading to the, I don't know if you call it the center or the holy land of interdisciplinary science and technology studies, she completed a PhD at the University of California, Santa Cruz in the History of Consciousness program there, working with none other than James Clifford and Donna Haraway on the concept of Native American DNA. And this work resulted in her first book, many of you have encountered, Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging and False Promise of Genetic Science, published in 2013. This is a dazzling exploration of the racial politics of gene talk in science and popular culture, and it's still with us, even more so now. Now, building on her research on the role of technoscience in settler colonialism, Dr. TallBear also studies the colonization of Indigenous sexuality, turning her focus towards how sex and nature can be understood differently in different Indigenous worldviews, and drawing on Indigenous feminist and queer theory to undermine this pervasive nature-culture split. My students hear about this all the time. In Western society and its role in colonialism, racism, sexism, homophobia, and environmental degradation. Now, her engagements and projects and accolades are just too many to relate here, and I know you want to get to her. She leads, but I want to say a couple of things. She leads a training program at the University of Alberta focused on Indigenous peoples' encounters with science and technology. She produces a regular podcast, which you should all check out, not while you're here, please, and is a regular commentator on national and international media. This is what I find very good. She is the co-coordinator of the, quote, sexy storytelling show, TP Confessions. Now, you must all check this out and get it to come to Halifax in the next year. Her deep and lasting involvement in the Oak Lake Writers Group has inspired her to take up creative prose format, including the poetic and the dialogue, which is not usually the site of academics' encounter in the world. And this is, bled over into her still favorite topic, technoscience, cultural politics. And so that's why we're here today. So please welcome Dr. TallBear to speak to us on that very topic. Decolonize does not equal reconciling science, technology, and Indigenous relations. Dr. TallBear.
I trust that. Great. It's great to be here. Thank you, everybody, for coming, and the people in the overflow rooms and that are streaming in. I'm really flattered and honored that there are so many people here. I get good audiences, but this is a really extra special audience, so thank you. And thank you to the local Indigenous and regional Indigenous people who came from this territory. I'm really honored that you're here as well. That doesn't always happen, so I really appreciate it. I thank you for the introduction. Both of the introductions, and I'm just going to elaborate a little bit on where I'm from. So I'm Sistan Wapton Oyate, and that's Dakota. If you're east of the Missouri River and into what is now Minnesota, that's Dakota people. West of the Missouri is the Lakota, which most people know, like Dances with Wolves and stuff. So, but we're culturally the same people, and then there are Nakota people in the middle. And some of our ancestors came up to lands now occupied by Canada after the 1862 war and some of the Indian wars, and so there are Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota peoples as well in Canada. The main thing that differentiates us is quite a small thing, and that's in the different languages. The L, the D, and the N are different, right? So in Dakota, we'd say like Wambadi for eagle, and Lakota would say Wambli. So it's mainly the languages that are a bit different, but the cultures are quite similar. And so I I came to Canada, I wanted to be back on the prairies. And even though it's not the prairies of home, it's pretty close. And my great-grandmother who raised me was actually Métis and Cree from Saskatchewan, but got exiled to South Dakota when she married my great-grandfather to live out the rest of her life there. So I do have relations up on the prairies here as well. So I'll get started. I'm going to give you a standard dictionary definition of reconciliation, because I think these definitions are important before I start talking about the science and technology part of things. So first we'll go through some definitions, and then I'll get into some examples of science and technology projects that I think are more decolonial than they are reconciliatory. But first, let's work through the definitions. So a standard dictionary definition of reconciliation is quite simply the restoration of friendly relations. However, I'm going to cite a scholar, Rachel George writes in a chapter entitled "Inclusion is just the Canadian word for assimilation." She writes that reconciliation is, quote, "as developed in the context of international mechanisms of redress, has come to denote a regeneration of broken relationships. The concept hinges on an idea that parties were once whole, experienced a rift, and need to be made whole again. In this context, reconciliation is at its core a state-building project that seeks to eliminate the differences forcing groups apart. By privileging national unity, reconciliation actively silences marginal voices that do not subscribe to the nation-state mentality. This is extremely problematic for Indigenous communities who do not see themselves within the settler state, but as self-determining nations." Okay, so number one, reconciliation language assumes everyone is on board with a one nation state idea and the need to make that whole. That's the first problematic aspect of it. Another important standard reconciliation definition is the action of making one view or belief compatible with another. So to reconcile, right? This kind of assumption that no doubt informs your average Canadian's understanding of reconciliation does not allow for thriving in everyday lives and within institutions that govern us of Indigenous ontologies or worldviews and the lifeways co-constituted with those worldviews. So when I use the word ontology, which is a term we use in the Academy, that means worldview, basically. So settler-colonial science and technology, and I will call that technoscience sometimes for short, has not only violated individual Indigenous peoples' rights in its exploitative research methods and practices historically, and in its inadequate policies of consent, and we've been talking about that this week in some of the classes I visited, right? Students here at King's are reading about those histories of inadequate consent and violations of people's rights in the process of scientific research. So that's gone on, the violation of individual rights, but perhaps more fundamentally, settler-colonial technoscience has helped the state, and probably the church too, because the state, the church, and science all work in concert. Settler thinkers might think that science, the church, and the state are separate, but they all work together. They're more on that side of the fence than Indigenous peoples are on this side of the fence. So it's helped the state and the church violate the rights of Indigenous collectives to their lifeways, their relations with their land and waterscapes, and the relations between human kin. So I think a lot about the individual versus the collective. And in settler colonial society, much more attention is paid to individual autonomy and individual rights. And in Indigenous communities, we are also, or maybe even more, concerned with collective rights, collective histories, collective identities, and relationships. And so that's a real key difference in worldview. And that really comes into conflict in the course of producing knowledge and doing science. So to come back to reconciliation, if reconciliation, or the making one nation state and making different views compatible with one another, requires putting out the generative fires of Indigenous worldviews, and it does, this is in fact a form of ongoing genocide. And if you are not familiar with the United Nations definition of genocide, I invite you to look it up. It's readily available. It's articles and particular definitions on the web. So literal physical extermination is only one very obvious way of eliminating a people as a people. And that's what's key to the UN definition of genocide. Eliminating a people as a distinct people, right? So physical extermination, which is the thing we most often hear about and think about when we look at histories of genocide, is also accompanied by a host of other eliminatory programs and policies also designed to eventually get rid of peoples as distinct peoples. Both Canada and the United States have built their respective Indian policy platforms in the 19th and 20th century especially around the elimination of Indigenous peoples as distinct peoples. Think residential schools, think mid-20th century assimilation policies, right? Think the Indian Act. These are eliminatory policies designed to assimilate or get rid of Indigenous peoples as peoples. These go along with an eliminatory or genocidal platform. We need to have a complex definition, as the United Nations does, of genocide. We've been having this conversation this year in Canada, right? And there's a lot of denial that this is what has been occurring. Okay. So in a world that respects the diversity of Indigenous peoples or nations, non-Indigenous people will in fact have to agree to disagree with Indigenous peoples in not only philosophical or worldview terms, but also in pragmatic and material terms. And this is difficult when you have such a large power imbalance between the state and Indigenous peoples. Or as Rod McInnes of McGill University and the former president of the American Society for Human Genetics ended his 2010 presidential address to that association, he said, this was really controversial when he said this, by the way, this was in Washington, D.C. If you've never been to the American Society for Human Genetics, it's like the mega church of science. There's like 7,000 to 8,000 scientists in this cavernous ballroom. They had the PowerPoint screens were like twice this size, and there were 3 of them, and the camera people were up on podiums. It was like literally the biggest mega church I've ever seen, and this is like where all the high priests of genetics go, right? And so, but Rod is this Canadian guy there was much more going on in Canadian federal policy around collaborating with Indigenous people around genomics than there was in the United States. And so when he got up and gave this very Indigenous-centric presidential address in 2010, there were some nervous US-based geneticists, to say the least. This was not radical in Canada, but it was there. So anyway, he said, with respect to genetic research with Indigenous populations, I suggest that we must now be invited into the metaphorical tent of Indigenous communities. The multicultural and international nature of the American Society for Human Genetics creates a major opportunity for it to make this happen to the benefit of all peoples. Are scientists and others, of course, willing to come into or under the metaphorical tents of Indigenous peoples in order to better their relations with us? That's my question. And frankly, yes, for the benefit of all peoples. It is, after all, Indigenous peoples worldwide who fight for and caretake land that retains the most biodiversity. Mostly non-Indigenous peoples refuse to come into our tents, or they refuse to come in non-extractive ways. So that's a challenge from him, and that's a challenge from me. The tendency of science and technology fields to universalize knowledge and ethics means that they constantly insist on their truth-telling privilege and power. Technoscientific fields still largely dismiss or marginalize Indigenous and other modes of knowing. In this way, settler technoscience, which is, of course, co-produced with Eurocentric worldviews and ethical frameworks, is central to genocidal colonialism. Science and technology fields have not only helped with literal physical extermination of peoples, think about nuclear weapons and eugenics science. And by the way, nuclear weapons, if you don't know, were developed by stealing, once again, Indigenous lands in the Pacific Northwest of what is now the United States. Uranium was mined from Indigenous lands. You had disproportionate rates of cancer coming from this, so a severe disruption of Indigenous relations with their bodies and also with their non-human kin in those lands. But it's not only literal physical extermination that science has played a role in. Technoscientific research questions, methods, and ethical frameworks also work to help eliminate us as Indigenous peoples definitionally. So they literally work to change the definitions of who we are, therefore defining us out of existence, right? That's one of those those policies that accompanies, if you can't literally physically exterminate people, you also work at the same time to define them out of existence. That's what the Indian Act has done, right? So I'm gonna give you an example that's more to do with science and technology. So I never want to assume everybody knows all the stuff going on in the US, because I try to not watch so much US news, but you all pay a lot of attention to the US up here, I've noticed. Like the National is 1/3 US news, then I shut it off. But I'm on Twitter all the time, so I get it anyway. But the Elizabeth Warren debacle is a really excellent example of defining Indigenous people out of existence. And so for the one or two of you in the audience that don't know, she's the one of the US Democratic presidential candidates who has claimed to be Cherokee, Native American racially, and even a woman of color. She pulled back from that one quickly, but so that controversy's been raging in the US actually since 2012. People accuse Trump of bringing it up, but her Republican opponent in the 2012 senatorial race in Massachusetts first brought it up, which is when she came to my attention. I've been talking to reporters since 2012 about Elizabeth Warren. She only took a DNA test last year in 2018, but Scott Brown challenged her to do it in 2012, and I was saying, and Cherokee experts on genealogy and citizenship were saying, do not take a DNA test, don't. In 2018, she gives in and takes it. And then it really kind of jumps into the public consciousness. So in summary, non-Indigenous understandings, definitions, and research priorities meant that Warren and those who support her DNA testing were actually working to define Indigenous people out of existence. And I'm tempted to explain all of the science to you, but I know that would take us off for like a half an hour. So I think I'm going to hold back, but just suffice it to say, the genetic ancestry test that she used that was interpreted by a scientist advising 23andMe, and that's one of the bigger companies. I'm sure some of you in here or your relatives have used those genetic ancestry tests. You can also get on ancestry.ca and get tests. They are tests that are looking for what scientists are calling Native American markers, so they're using a racial category that they can trace to the founding populations in the Americas. And so they're not markers that are related to any specific relative or person that you can put a name on. These are indicative of populations in the Americas, right? And so that's when you get a test back that says, I'm 17% Native American, or I'm 11% or 23%, it's a probability that you have ancestry going back to the founding populations. That's very, very different than how First Nations, bands, tribes in the US define what it is to be a citizen. We don't care about a percentage of ancestry related to founding populations. We care about who's your grandmother, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, who's listed on that roster of our citizens. And a genetic ancestry test that you buy from 23andMe can't tell you that, right? So we use another kind of DNA, but it's not that. We'll use paternity tests a lot. Anyway, so the science is really complicated. But what the public took away from the Elizabeth Warren case was she and her handlers and the press and the public interpreting what she did with that DNA test, they really foregrounded stereotypes. So if you remember, she actually talked about having high cheekbones, right? Like her grandfather had high cheekbones. They're just like all the Indians. That's a literal quote. She foregrounded and also do a lot of people who have this myth in their family, and it's really common throughout the South and the East of the United States. She foregrounded settler mythologies, kind of national mythologies about Indigenous people. So one of those national myths, because the Cherokee, probably second to the Mormons, are some of the most well-documented people in the world. They have a tremendous amount of genealogy. They had a printing press, they had a newspaper in the middle of the 18th century. They were one of the first Indigenous peoples in what's now the US to put their language down into print. Very, very well documented. Nonetheless, there's this national myth in the South and the East of the United States that there were the real Cherokees. Many Cherokees hid in plain sight as white people. They hid out. They didn't go to Indian territory, they weren't removed, they hid out in the mountains. That's simply not true. They are very, very well documented. But it's a story people like to tell when they're claiming a myth of a Cherokee great-grandmother in the family. The other thing that happened around that story was that Indigenous people were always located in the past. So if you look up Native or whatever the terms are, we use different terms in the US than you use in Canada, and you'll see me going back and forth. But if you look up Aboriginal or Native American, you will what do you get? You're not going to get me, right? In my like leather leggings and my big earrings. You're going to get beads and feathers. You're going to get what you're supposed to look like, right? You're going to get a man in a headdress, a prototypical Native man in a headdress. Just look at the images. They're often locating us in the past. We're also always supposed to be disappearing, and this is one of the narratives that scientists have that make them do the science that they do. One of their mantras is we must sample Indigenous peoples globally. We must get their blood before they disappear into a sea of admixture. That means mixing. That means we're not really Indigenous enough for them to sample and bleed if we're too mixed, right? So they're substituting their biological definition of who we are, their genetic definition of who we are, for our own definitions, which are much more complicated than biological ancestry alone. It's not that we don't use biological ancestry, but that's not all that we use. So those are some of the kind of key narratives and myths that inform the whole situation around Elizabeth Warren, and that's what I've been critiquing in the media and in some of my work. So this is just one contemporary example that shows how authoritative settler ethical frameworks, narratives, and knowledge claims undergird science that is integral to the ongoing colonization and elimination of Indigenous people. There's an eliminatory aspect if you're defining us out of existence because we're too admixed, right? And scientists, as you probably know, have a lot more cultural authority over what counts as the truth than Indigenous peoples have over what counts as the truth. So what's really at stake is a debate and a fight between whose definitions count. And Indigenous pushback to Elizabeth Warren and to Joseph Boyden a couple of years ago, who I guess also took a DNA test, but he didn't release his results, which I find very interesting. I want to know his results, just so I can critique the science in it. These are debates between definitions, right? And a DNA test, a genetic ancestry test, is a settler-colonial piece of knowledge production. It's a settler-colonial definition of what counts. It's not our definition. So you can take it, and it's really interesting. But you're making a really interesting and kind of egregious political move if you take that test and say, therefore, I am. Whatever. Okay. Oh, I got off on a longer story than I meant to. And I'll also say, so you can't see it really clearly, but the American Progress, what is it? 1872, John Gast. This was originally Columbia, right? And Columbia is, such manifest destiny. Did you have a term for that in Canada, manifest destiny? Something like that. Anyway, manifest destiny, right? The settler, the European, was destined by God to inherit the land. So you've got the Indians in the front running away on horseback, and then you've got the covered wagon with the farmers coming with their animals behind that. The buffalo are being chased to the west as well, so look how dark it is in the west, and the lights in the east, because that's where the white people have already colonized. And then behind Columbia, who's holding the Book of Knowledge, you've got the stagecoach, and you've got the steam engine, and all of this civilization, right, chasing these poor, sad Indians into the darkness. Well, my friend, an anthropologist who will remain unnamed, photoshopped Elizabeth Warren's onto Columbia's face. I love that picture anyway. I know, that's petty, huh? All right. But a lot of her rhetoric has been like that, right? Bringing knowledge and good. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about the US settler presidential election because that's a whole other talk. All right, so we've got to go back to definitions a little bit. Now I want to talk about indigenization as reconciliation and how this differs from decolonization. And you probably hear these words thrown around the university and thrown around communities. And often when we're using words like indigenization or decolonization, we're not always talking about the same thing. And you might want to have a conversation the next time you use that word. Well, what do you mean when you say that? And see if you actually mean the same thing. So before I explain why we need a substantive, radical, if you will, form of decolonization, I first want to explain these two words. And I'm drawing on fellow Indigenous studies scholars here. So there's an article that came out, I think it was just last year, by Adam Gaudry, who's a Métis scholar in my faculty at University of Alberta, and Danielle Lorenz, and I can't remember where Danielle is. But they wrote this article that I think is really a must-read for those who are interested in indigenization, reconciliation, and decolonization within the Canadian Academy, and many of you in here will be interested. So they just go through these definitions. So conceptually, they say, think it's, yeah, you can read along. Indigenization represents a move to expand the Academy's still narrow conceptions of knowledge to include, that's the key word, include Indigenous perspectives in transformative ways. That's kind of like diversity, right? You include me into your project. So they say Indigenous inclusion aims to increase the number of Indigenous students in the Academy, so that's equity, diversity, and inclusion, right? Supports adaptation of Indigenous students to the Academy. It's conceived Indigenization as primarily a matter of inclusion and access, and merely by including more Indigenous people, it's believed that universities can indigenize without substantive or substantial structural change. That's the first level that we have, and I think that's where a lot of our conversations are in the university right now. There's a second level then, and they call this reconciliation indigenization. And that aims for a common or middle ground, they say, creates a broader consensus regarding what counts as knowledge. So how can knowledges be reconciled? That's going a little bit farther. It's not just including Indigenous people into the dominant project and say rainbowing up the laboratory, but it's also thinking about changing knowledge a little bit. So this attempts, they say, to alter the university's structure, including, and this is really important, educating Canadian faculty, staff, and students to change how they think about and act toward Indigenous people. So that's a second level. It's not only about including Indigenous people, but it's actually everybody else getting a little bit smarter about how they engage with Indigenous people and changing the way that they act as well. But we want to go even farther than that. So this word decolonization. And I think people tend to use decolonization and indigenization interchangeably. I'm actually really pessimistic about the ability for us to indigenize the university. But that's all I'm willing to say right now because I haven't really thought it out. But I am interested in decolonization more. That's something I think more about and I feel that I work more on. So they say, Gaudry and Lorenz, that decolonial indigenization, quote, envisions the wholesale overhaul of the Academy to fundamentally reorient knowledge production based on a balancing of power relations between Indigenous peoples and Canadians, thus transforming the Academy into something dynamic and new. So then I want to call attention to Tuck and Yang's article, Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. Who in here has read that article? A few of you. It's a great article. I think it's really important to read. I think it came out in 2012 in this journal, which is open access. You can Google it and get it right now, but you can wait. So they say that decolonization, and I think about this every time I use the word now, I think about this definition. Decolonization brings about the repatriation or the restoration of Indigenous land and life. It's about restoring land. This is where this hashtag landback comes from on Twitter. You'll see this a lot on Indigenous Twitter, landback. And life. And everything else falls under life. There's a lot that we can use those terms broadly and flexibly, land and life. They say don't make it a metaphor. It's not a metaphor for other things we want to do to improve our societies and schools. The easy adoption of decolonizing discourse, evidenced by the increasing number of calls to decolonize our schools, decolonizing methods, decolonize student thinking, they say turns decolonization into a metaphor. So every time you use the word decolonization now, you think about what's being restored or what's potentially restored to Indigenous peoples. I find that really useful in my own work as well. I was being a little loosey-goosey with the term myself. So we can understand genomic science and technology research and development broadly, the building of institutions, labs, human resource capacity, including student training, within a framework of repatriating Indigenous land and life. So how do we educate people? How do we build laboratories? How do we ask research questions? How do we do technology development in ways that are not extracting from Indigenous peoples, that are not built on the exploitation of their bodies, lands, and non-human relations, but how can you do that in ways that actually restore? That's what I think about in the work that I do, and I'll give you some examples here in a minute. So land and life can include what settlers call resources. I don't like that word, but I use it, right? Intellectual capacities and governance capacities, because not only have resources been extracted from Indigenous peoples and their lands, right, and their non-human relations, but our capacities for self-governance and sovereignty have been undermined. Our kinship relations with our human family have been disrupted and undermined by settler policies of assimilation and elimination. So the policies now going forward and knowledge production activities going forward need to pay attention to how they restore what's been taken. Very pragmatically, we can talk about the repatriation of remains and bones, which we need to do, and not everybody wants to do that because science. We can talk about the repatriation of blood and DNA samples sitting in freezers around the world that were taken during earlier regimes when the ethics were inadequate according to what we think now. They're having a national conversation in Australia right now about how to rehabilitate all these old blood samples and freezers for new uses, and they've got it's a National Indigenous Genomic Center where they're leading this conversation. You can talk about capacity building, so student training, professorships, funding, doing community-based research in ways that are actually transferring resources to the community when you're doing that. I will tell you, I and another non-Indigenous researcher at U of A just turned back $500,000 on a science project because while they said they wanted to do Indigenous communities research, they literally would not let us fund researchers in the community, like cut them a check and buy them laptops. If you're not willing to do something as little as that, and SSHRC and NSERC can't figure out how to do that, you cannot do community-based research. So one of the things to pay attention to is administrative stuff. It's totally unsexy, right? The administration of and the budgets and the financials of the university, but those are the things that are really immediately hindering us doing that kind of research. It's not community-based research if I can't give some money and resources to the community, right? What are they thinking? I have no idea. Anyway, so I gave the money back because I'm like, I can't deal with this right now. We'll come back to it later. Okay, so I'm going to talk about, though, with those definitions in mind, right, repatriating Indigenous land and life, some projects that I've worked on in my own career, both my academic career, which didn't start until I was 32 when I went back to do a PhD. Before that, as Gordon said, I was a planner and a policy specialist working for federal agencies, tribal organizations on environmental cleanup projects. So the first one, okay. I'm just going to talk off slides here. And I have, like 10 more minutes, Gordon? But I do like Q&A. And I know 45 minutes as an audience is max. That's what I think for listening to one voice. So this was a really cool project. This happened 10 years ago already. This is when I was an assistant professor in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at the University of California, Berkeley. Brilliant people there, but I am a prairie person, and living in the Bay Area just, it was miserable. But this was really cool. So my co-parent was the tribal environmental planner, the lead planner for the Pinoleville Pomo Nation, which is up in Mendocino County, which also has amazing organic wines. So Mendocino County, Ukiah is the county seat, and what I loved about Mendocino County was it's a really native place. There's a lot of tribes there in around that area of California. So I'm sure it was my co-parent and I probably started brokering this research relationship. I don't remember now. But there were Professor Alice Agagino, who's in the engineering school, got some architects from Berkeley together. They have a world-renowned architecture program. And then some students from probably the Energy Resources Group, and then from my department, Environmental Science, Policy, and Management. And they decided to help the tribe, Pinoleville Pomo Nation, build green housing. And the problem is US green building standards. They define what it is to be green or sustainable according to these really urban-centric ideas. So these foo-foo architects and engineers from Berkeley in the Bay Area went out to Pinoleville, which is this rural town of, Ukiah is a rural town of 25,000, very agricultural, there's some wine growing stuff, but people, they don't want mixed-use housing. They have big families. The native people, they weave canoes, they weave baskets, they need places for their regalia and their canoes, and they got multi-generations living in the same household. And they were really struggling with this initial dialogue between the university, the faculty, and they brought their students out, and then the communities. But what they did is they had these series of design charrettes and conversations where they had elders, they had kids, they had even professionals working for the tribe who weren't native or who weren't tribal members, because they were a part of the community and the intellectual capacity in that community. And they had conversations over the course of a couple of years about how to build these green, sustainable houses. And one of the things they discovered in conversation is sustainability isn't, you can't separate science from society. You can't separate nature from culture, because those things co-produce one another, they shape one another. And they learned that sustainability had to consider what we would think of as cultural aspects, right? So for example, the families wanted more round spaces in their houses, not only because they congregated socially in ways that were facilitated by round spaces, but also because spirits hide in square corners. They wanted windows in the east for morning prayers, big windows. Well, this and the round spaces messed with the slope of the ceiling and the roof, messed with their kind of calculations around heating and cooling in winter and summertime, so that the cultural and social needs dictated an actual physical change to the architecture that cost more money, and that messed with the environmental sustainability of the house. So these are the kinds of things that they had to work out. And what they learned is of course the community had a tremendous amount of technical knowledge, right? And they also had a lot of social knowledge. The architects and engineers not only had technical knowledge, but they had social biases. I actually don't let my students use the word bias, because that assumes that it's possible to be neutral, and it's not. We all stand somewhere. So when my students try to use the word bias versus objective, I'm like, nope, just talk about where you stand, because that white male scientist in the lab, he stands somewhere too. It's not like he's neutral and you're biased, right? I mean, we can talk about all of us being biased, but I find that very negative energy and language. I'd rather talk about where we stand, where we're situated, what our stakes are in a particular research question or method or value, et cetera. So anyway, moving ahead, these students, graduate students and undergrad students, and look how diverse they are. They're really diverse students. A lot of these students didn't feel like they belonged in engineering either. So this was really interesting. So Professor Agogino brings all these students out, and there's these great conversations happening around how to build the house, but there's also this little boy up here on the straw bale. He was hanging out and playing Legos with this young man, Ryan Shelby, who's now got a PhD and is off doing engineering. Ryan comes from a sharecropping lineage in rural Alabama. Ryan wasn't supposed to be an engineer either. And he and this little boy were talking and playing Legos. That made the impression on some of those kids in that community that they too could go to Berkeley and be engineers. Now, Pinoleville's only 100 miles away from Berkeley, but it's a world away. And these native kids did not think they could do engineering at Berkeley. So having this diverse body of students come out and write their dissertations and write their theses on this and work with this community, a lot of work got done and houses got built. So that's, to me, that's a really interesting example of restoring capacity, right? Intellectual capacity. There's an element of self-governance in this. Not only in an informal way, but in a formal way. The tribe had to develop their own green building codes to include cultural sustainability, because US federal green building codes didn't cut it. Very interesting. So this is another project. This is probably the main project that I work on in terms of decolonizing science and technology. That's not research, but it's rather training and capacity building. So in 2010, I think it was, we started the Summer Internship for Indigenous Peoples in Genomics, or SING, week-long summer training program at the University of Illinois. And it was all non-Indigenous scientists at the time, but critical young scientists who were already working in collaborative relationships with Indigenous communities. And then I came on with a couple of other Indigenous social science scholars as somebody who was thinking about the ethics and situating genome training within a project of decolonization. And those of you who have worked in labs know you're probably getting usually maybe one ethics course. You're not talking about the role of science and technology in colonization pretty much. You might be looking at federal bioethical guidelines, but that we go far beyond that. We do that, but we talk about histories of colonization, and we do some history of science, right? And then we also network participants in the program, which could be undergrads, grad students. We've even had postdocs and assistant professors come in, because while they're Indigenous scientists with PhDs, they never got the training in decolonial science and histories of colonization. And they come and they build this professional network. In 2016, we started in New Zealand. In 2018, we started SING Canada, and SING Australia just started this last December. And so we have a global SING network. We also do publications together. We've published policy pieces in Science and Nature Communications, pretty big publications. We're very clear that we put the junior, untenured Indigenous scientists at the front of those publications. So we're really working strategically to get them published. We're also bringing in community members. So these were community members down in New Zealand, some of the community members, and they tend to be older sometimes, they are really concerned about how do we make sure that our interests are protected if we're going to consider genome research at all? And one of the ways for them to help protect community interests is to come into the lab and spend a week with young scientists from their community, but also scientists in the university, learn a little bit the culture of science and what's happening, and they're better equipped to go home and evaluate a research project and see if it's in their interest or not. So these are just some pictures from Sing Canada in 2018. We are going to move around Canada, and I've been talking to a couple of scientists here about coming to Dalhousie in 2021, 22, maybe to do something focused on the genomic aspects of epidemiology. So what we want to do is move around Canada from year to year, and then we'll change our theme each year depending on what the areas of expertise are in that area, and depending on what the Indigenous communities around that institution want. So in 2018, we started at Simon Fraser, and we did clam and conservation genomics and worked with some communities out there. The participants came from all across Canada. We had one American as well, a young man from LA, who was the only male in the whole thing. And I said, how do you feel being the only guy? He's right down here. He's like, I love it. So, and a lot of them were older women too. So this was a really interesting year. Just some pictures of them in the lab at SFU. And then last summer, we went to University of Alberta, and we focused on the genomic aspects of chronic wasting disease. I have a graduate student, Arlana Bennett, who's Métis, who did her master's degree in the Agricultural, Life, and Environmental Sciences program around chronic wasting disease. Now she's doing a PhD in Native Studies with me, and she helped organize and was one of the main faculty on this summer program. She thinks a lot about how Indigenous hunters and people on the land do have a lot of knowledge about the bodies of animals, and they have knowledge about the landscape and the way that chronic wasting disease is affecting these animals. They're also thinking at U of A about developing handheld technologies, because right now what happens is you got to take the head of the animal and bring this in for analysis. It's hard to carry a head around, right? In the winter, it's easier because it stays frozen in the back of your truck. But anyway, they're trying to develop this handheld technology so they can test out in the field. There's no evidence that this is going to jump into humans, but of course, people still don't want to eat and consume an animal that might have a prion disease. So we focused on that at U of A. We're going to come back to U of A this summer simply because we have some H. pylori researchers at U of A Med School who want to do this here. So we're thinking about coming, and then we're thinking about coming to Dalhousie for epidemiology. We're probably going to go to Montreal and work with both Concordia and McGill on a session focused on genetic ancestry testing. That'll be very controversial. Anyway, so if you've got institutions around the country that might be interested, we can talk. And this is open to anybody who's Indigenous. People sometimes come from other countries as well, but it's primarily students from Canada. Our major funder is Genome Canada. And so one final project I'll just give an example of that's more of an environmental project, or there's a couple of examples here. This is one good example and I think one poor example of Indigenous governance through science. So on your left is a picture it's a group of Amamutsan people, or they're more commonly known as Ohlone in Central Coast, California, and they're up into the Bay Area. That's their traditional homelands. They have been working with local landowners in Central Coast, California. This is near Santa Cruz. Who are non-Indigenous, but they are settlers that have been there for quite a long time, because California was, of course, settled pretty early. So you might have families that have been in that area for a couple, 300 years. And they have a lot of local knowledge about the landscape. And so they're working with the Amamutsan and then the California Department of Environmental Quality. They've had a lot of forest fire problems, as we have had in Canada. Well, you get a lot of forest fire problems when you're undercutting Indigenous ways of doing land management and fire management. And so they're really working to combine their knowledges to think about how to do better fire management. And I thought that's just one of the things that facilitated that too. It's really interesting. The Amamutsan are not a federally recognized tribe. So there's a lot of tension in the United States between state regulatory agencies and tribal regulatory agencies, because we actually have in the US what's called treatment as a state, which means we can apply to the federal agencies for funding to regulate our environments in the same way a state would. So we compete with states. And then we have separate sets of regulations, and tribal regs on the environment are often stricter than state regulations, because tribes tend to be in red states, which are the conservative states, right? You're blue up here, right, for conservative? No. Is it opposite? Opposite, yeah. We're red, the Republicans are red. So the tribes, even though they are much more progressive voters usually, are in these conservative states that have really poor environmental regulations. So, but when the land is right there and the river's cutting across your both lands, states get annoyed because tribes have strict regulations and the states are violating them. Anyway, because Amamutsan didn't have federal recognition and didn't set their own regulations, and because also California has stricter environmental regs, they were really able to work well together without that federal intervention. That was very interesting. The bad example, this is me a long time ago. This is a sample DNA, sample tribal ID. So it's an example of a DNA testing company, and they do this. They go out to tribal conferences and they try to sell their wares at the trade shows. And they were trying to sell DNA tests to tribal enrollment directors. So we have offices where you do enrollment or citizenship applications with all the genealogical records and all of that kind of stuff, and it's managed in this very bureaucratic way by our tribal governments in the US. Well, the DNA testing companies came to one of their conferences. They're trying to sell them not only DNA tests, but a smart card that has all of your information for all of the different tribal social service agencies within it. A couple of risks from that. They were recommending, because these DNA testing companies and their scientists didn't understand anything about histories of federal tribal policy. They didn't understand anything about tribal citizenship. They don't understand anything about relocation and removal and all of that stuff. And they were recommending across the tribe DNA testing. So if you go into a room, and this is parentage testing, by the way, not the kind Elizabeth Warren did. If you go into a room like this and you test everybody to see who their parents are, there's going to be a percentage of you without the dads or grandpas you think you have. You don't want to do that, right? You're disrupting kinship relations. You're going to get some people thrown out of the tribe or the family, and your grandma's not going to be happy with you. So be careful when you do DNA tests. Some of you probably know this. You find stuff out, right, on Ancestry.com. Big risk. The second risk is they actually had no provisions for tribal community management and storage of DNA. They hadn't thought about, should the tribe actually hold their own samples? You know, should they manage that data themselves? They're like, well, no, we'll protect your confidentiality. They just, no clue that this is a conversation that Indigenous communities were having, that if we are going to participate in this kind of research, we retain the biologicals, we retain control over them, and we retain control over the data. So, again, science and technology can be taken up by Indigenous communities in ways that can expand our capacities and our governance authorities, but it can also be used in ways that undermine it. So the final lesson is, when Indigenous peoples are making critiques of your science, they're not being anti-science, they're being critical of your bad politics. Because we're very clear, we can see very clearly the colonial politics that are thread through all kinds of projects in society. And there is a lot of interest in Indigenous communities in scientific projects, both quote unquote Western science and in traditional science. And I don't actually see a hard line between those two things necessarily. I'm interested in both. So I think I'm gonna, so I was gonna come back to Truth and Reconciliation, and if for anybody that hasn't read the calls to action for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I trash reconciliation, but I still think you should read the calls to action. Because they recommend what different sectors in Canadian society can do to not assimilate Indigenous peoples and to not eliminate our worldviews, and they cover many different sectors of society, media, health, education. I recommend that you look at that. There's really a lot of room in there to read between the lines and see what people in the academy can do, particularly people in science and technology. So I'm going to stop there because it's 8:05 and I really would like to do some Q&A. So thank you. Thank you. Are you going to?
Okay. Thank you, Dr. TallBear, for your talk and everything you shared. I more or less just have a comment, somewhat of some disappointment in the space, in that, you know, when we have an Indigenous scholar like yourself, or Indigenous students like me and many others, it's to have someone like you is once in a lifetime for many Indigenous students in this space. And when we talk about even a land acknowledgement, land acknowledgements in our syllabuses, you know, at the beginning, and I don't want to take away from Elder Billy's acknowledgement, and you know, I respect Elder Billy, and he talked way more than a land acknowledgement. He gave an actual teaching, but from time to time they're superficial in just looking at this space, and how, you know, we have Indigenous students right now having to sit in in the hallways or upstairs and not being able to see you in person. And I think that's, it's rooted in how, this institution and many others like it, don't do tangible things to actually help Indigenous students and make the space accessible to them. And, I know the faculty at U of A is quite big, but I was hoping if you could comment in ways in which universities can actually do tangible things beyond a simple land acknowledgement to support Indigenous students and allow them into the space. For example, actually allocating space for those Indigenous students to be here. So thank you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know that I've been in an event at U of A where that's come up. We have a lot of other programs that, because I've been talking in some of these sessions this week about all the stuff that's going on in the prairie provinces, right, around indigenization of universities. And I do think we're leading the way out there. I think so, because we have so many Indigenous faculty in those institutions, not only in the Faculty of Native Studies, but in other faculties. Yeah, that's really interesting, because I feel like we do have really good Indigenous turnout. I never get a turnout like this, though, at U of A. Like, they're so used to me, right, that, whatever. So I don't, I think that's a really good point to make, though, and for people to figure out how to make that space, right, or designate that space. The only thing I do worry about, right, and we've talked about this in some of the sessions, is once you start saying this is space for Indigenous people, then you have to start monitoring who's Indigenous and who's not, right? And maybe you want to take that on anyway, but that is a delicate thing that happens with that. So, but I do really appreciate that comment, and I'm sorry that I'm honored that this is there's such an amazing turnout, and I'm a little surprised, I have to say. So I appreciate that. Maybe we can talk more, and I can think with you about it. Yeah.
And there was one right in the hall. We were trying to invent a microphone cannon that you could blow, but that's not going to ever work.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I'm just going to kind of go off what Aaron said. I had to push my way into this room. I'm Cree, and I was in one of the other rooms with the live stream, and there's a bunch of my Indigenous friends who were stuck there and couldn't come in, so I was just wondering if it would be possible to bring in some of those folks, because I'm sure they would have questions. I was lucky enough to talk to you the other day, so I won't ask a question, but I think it would be really hard for them to see this on the live stream and not be able to ask a question. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Yeah, so you mentioned in your speech there about a green building initiative, sort of, or a green initiative in sustainability. And I come from a energy sustainability background, and also as a Cleachell citizen, I'm very curious what other Indigenous-led green initiatives there are out there, and like how are communities kind of approaching that? Because it is really hard. We're kind of, in Canada, it's like provincial-based or municipal-based or whatever, but it gets a little tricky to try and think a little more holistically about those Indigenous cultures at least when I'm trying to do green projects. It seems like there's a lot more nonprofits that are more into kind of more like greener natural building style initiatives. So yeah, my question is just like how would I look more into that, I guess?
I mean, and I'm not working on environmental stuff as much anymore, and I have to say up here, because you don't have the same, to my understanding, First Nations up here and other Indigenous communities don't have the same regulatory authorities that we have in tribal government in the US, is that correct? I think that's correct. Doesn't surprise me that there's more going on through nonprofit organizations, right? Because I see that in terms of the Indigenous governance of environmental stuff, it is much more kind of multi-sectoral than it is for us. But yeah, so I don't know that I'm plugged in enough to talk about that stuff with you, but I would suggest, are you Indigenous yourself?
I am, yeah. I'm from the Northwest Territories.
Right, so I mean, obviously are you on social media a lot?
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's how I find out what's going on, right? I'm all over native Twitter, right, and social media, and I figure out who's who that way, so. Okay. Anyway, yeah, I know, I'm on the genome and sexuality stuff now, so.
Yeah, no, that's all new to me, so it was really cool to hear about it today. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So you mentioned you're on to, if you could just repeat what you're working on now?
Well, the genetic stuff, I'm mostly involved in training and not research as much.
And sexuality?
And decolonizing sexuality stuff, yeah. And
Did you talk on that this evening?
I'm going to talk on that tomorrow in the philosophy colloquium. So I don't use the term indigenization as much as I use the term decolonization, because I think about that Tuck and Yang definition, right? Decolonization brings about the repatriation of indigenous land and life. It's not a metaphor for other things we want to do. So think about how you hear people talk about decolonizing. Like, I'm going to decolonize my hairstyle. I don't know. If there's some restoration of resources involved in decolonizing your hairstyle, you can say that. But you have to think about that, right? So not to just so easily adopt decolonizing language for everything, but think about how you're restoring indigenous land and life. And that can be all kinds of resources and capacities that go under that definition of life. Indigenization tends to get used more as equity and inclusion and as reconciliation a little bit, right? So this idea that you're including people into the academy, you're giving them access. The critique is that universities think by doing equity, diversity, and inclusion that they can indigenize without substantial structural change. And then reconciliation, indigenization is focused more on having non-Indigenous Canadians come to understand maybe Indigenous customs and lifeways and that kind of thing. Educate themselves also about that colonial history. It's not that those aren't important things to do, but that's not enough, right? What these Indigenous scholars are calling for is what they're calling decolonial indigenization, which is actually involving the restoration of intellectual capacities, governance authorities, and actual material resources. And so that's to keep those definitions in mind when you're thinking about how to, does that help? Okay, good. Thank you. And this article's great too, so that'll explain a lot of that. Not this one, but also the Gaudry and Lorenz.
Woman. My question is, like, when we deal with the governments and they talk about reconciliation, so we're dealing with the governments, yet they want to reconcile with our people, but they go out and they sell our lands. They don't ask, there's no consultation.
Yeah.
They bring in these corporations that are going to poison and affect all of our lands, but yet they talk about reconciliation. I don't see a reconciliation there, because we have to stand up and we have to start fighting for our own lands. So where is that reconciliation in there?
Well, by their definition, right?
Yeah.
If they include some Indigenous leaders into the negotiations with resource extraction companies, that would be reconciliation, right? That's not going to the level that I think Indigenous critics want it to go, obviously. So it's about those different definitions. Yeah, I mean, I reject the language of reconciliation. I think it's, I think substantively there's a lot in the calls to action, and I understand that the TRC Commission did a lot of important work. They're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, so I don't reject that. We can take guidance from the TRC calls to action, but the term reconciliation itself, I think, doesn't go far enough, right? And I think a lot of the people involved in that process would agree with that as well. So again, when thinking about how decisions need to get made about the land, I think we really do need to look to that decolonial definition of, I mean, that's easier said than done, right? So I think you just dispute the whole definition of reconciliation, right? It's not going to work as it's defined. So anyway, that's not really an answer, but yes.
We got a question from the people watching online.
Okay.
And the question is, what kind of structural changes to the academia might work towards decolonization?
Let me go back to my PowerPoint. What kind of structural changes to academia? I mean, we think a lot, this brings up the question of, can you decolonize the academy? I work in really discrete ways that are about giving resources back to communities, right? One of the reasons I left planning is because I don't have these macro level visions for how to change institutions. Not all of us can do that. What I do think about is how I can work in my really small ways to restore Indigenous land, life, and resources. So one of the reasons that I work to train Indigenous scientists, and I've been saying this in classes this week, it's not because I think by training Indigenous scientists we're going to find the world's cure to all the epidemic diseases that have a genetic component in Indigenous communities. I don't think that. I think the main benefits of genomic research are the building of the bricks and mortars of these institutions, these laboratories, and the careers and training the students who work on that. Those are the real benefits. Economic development and the building of scientific institutions. We have seen very little actual, I think, medical breakthrough from the mapping of the human genome, and that's not what I think about. So the reason I want to train scientists is because I want to pull those resources and those capacities out to further our own Indigenous community governance. And so that's why I work on things like this. So in a sense, I'm a little bit cynical. So I'm not actually thinking about decolonizing the academy as much as I'm thinking about pulling resources out to build our own capacities in our own communities. Now, I'm the child of a person who was a main grant writer for one of the survival schools in the 1970s. So I know that Indigenous communities, we've tried to break away and build our own educational institutions. I went to school in one of those. My siblings went to school in a tribal school. So we keep coming around in this circle in which we're like, we can't decolonize here, we can't remake that institution, let's go start our own institutions. But you're stuck in this colonial edifice where the money you're applying for to do that work is from the settler government that extracted all your resources in the first place to build the state. So I don't know that I believe in decolonizing the academy. I believe in doing what I can to pull the resources out that I need to help build Indigenous capacities and livelihoods, and in the course of that, lessen suffering and promote our own intellectual sovereignty. And that might sound like a little bit of a cynical answer, but that's what I'm doing.
Hi, sorry, thank you very much. On the topic of decolonization, on the sort of the Tuck and Yang definition, I was talking about the restoration of Indigenous lands and lives. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about, I guess, like, when I picture that, and maybe other people picture that as well, they think of like a return to a like historical kind of like that life. I was wondering if you could talk about sort of like the notion of decolonization as it maybe relates to sort of like trends in Indigenous futurism, like the development of like science and technology, but also like the more imaginative aspect of that. Like, does that have kind of a role in decolonization, do you think?
You probably know better than me, it sounds like. I don't work on Indigenous futures, but I have friends that do, right? And you would think that I would. I've been asked to kind of think about AI stuff lately, and I'm kind of not, that's a big project, right? Do you know Jason Edward Lewis's work in his Indigenous Futures Lab at Concordia? No. Yeah, so check out the Indigenous Futures Initiative at Concordia, and then his partner Scawanati is a kind of cyber artist, and they think a lot about this kind of stuff. But yeah, I think that question of people think decolonization means settlers are always afraid you're going to do to them what they've done to everybody else. So whatever their fears are, that tells you they know what their ancestors really did, right? Nobody's going to kick anybody out. What they're asking for is for people to come into better relation with these lands and these first peoples. That's what they're asking for. And yes, that requires sacrifice, and it's not going to be easy. But it's not about putting everybody on a boat and sending them back, or putting them in camps or residential schools to re-indoctrinate them, right? Yeah, so, and I think there are Indigenous people working in Indigenous futures who are thinking about that, right? So there's a slippery slope, though, and I'm going to write about this in my next book. This is kind of getting into a more theoretical conversation. If we want people to come into good relation with us, how do they do that without appropriating our identities and saying that they are us? You can be kin to us without being us. Right? My aunt, my best aunt, who does the most for me in the world, is a white woman with 4 grandparents from Sweden. She never claims to be Dakota, never. But she's there at all of our family things. She's the best aunt I've ever had. So again, you can be kin to us without being us. So be very careful about making those kinds of appropriative claims. You don't have to do it to be a good kin relation, right? So that's the kind of stuff I'm thinking about. And then how does that, what does that result in pragmatically? What does that mean for how we live well together? And I think there's a lot of work to be done articulating that, right? And we've got people trying to think through that. But while we are centering the settler state and its multicultural inclusive project, instead of centering good relations between peoples, we're not going to get very far, because the settler state cannot be redeemed. It is not the project. And I'm not saying tear everything down. I'm not that kind of radical, because I was kind of an incremental planner when I was a planner, like incremental changes. But I do think it's really important to start telling a different story. We need to re-indoctrinate ourselves with a story of relationality and relationships and making good relations, and take our love that is focused on this really dysfunctional, violent, inherently hierarchical settler state, and turn that towards being good relations to one another. And from there will emanate pragmatic policies. At least I'm a theorist, so that's my answer, right? I'm going to tell a different narrative and I'm going to theorize about that. And then there are many of us throughout different sectors of society that can work on kind of pragmatic outcomes of telling that new kind of story. But we're telling ourselves the wrong story, and it's very difficult to make changes with the wrong narrative guiding us.
So I'm studying city planning at Dalhousie, and I understand that you've totally shifted away from that.
Yeah.
But this is more so kind of a question on how to come into these communities, kind of looking into research. So in planning, we talk a lot about a participatory planning experience. So you go into communities and you really kind of work with them and you listen and learn to what they have to say. But I recently went to a lecture from Pictou Landing First Nation about the issue that occurred, that is about Boat Harbor and kind of the environmental racism and whatnot that happened in their community. One thing that they expressed a comment about is that they're really great at giving PhDs, pretty much. And they're getting a lot of researchers, like a lot of researchers come in, but they leave with the research. So what my question is how, for future researchers, how can you develop relationships with these communities if maybe they're, you know, even in genomics or anything related? How can researchers come into these communities and, you know, contribute and give this information and, you know, still enhance that participatory experience?
You know, I'm not up on the planning literature because I finished school in '94. But certainly I came to work with scientists based out of a planner sensibility that research is for social change. That is why we do research. Some of us just don't admit it, that we're doing research for a particular type of social world, right? So I actually felt like planners were farther along than scientific researchers or anthropologists who, when I came into the academy, I started working with and interacting with and reading their work. So I will say so I imagine planning has followed or been ahead of where the genome sciences are in terms of there being a literature about collaborative methodologies. I'm sure that I would hope that that's out there, because it certainly isn't genomics now. There's a robust literature that's emerged in the last 20 years especially. I will say that the people that I know that work best collaboratively with communities, first of all, as a graduate student or a student, you cannot do that on your own. You will not do it well, and it will be a burden to the community. So, and even for Indigenous students to go into a community, the only way I think you're going to be able to do true collaborative community-based research is if you get on a research team where the principal investigator has a long established and good working relationship. And the people that I see that work collaboratively with Indigenous communities are really willing to have their careers hijacked by that collaborative process. If you think you're going to go in quickly and get out, then don't even bother to do it, because don't work with Indigenous communities if that's how you want to work. And that's how science works, right? There's a pressure to publish quickly. There's a pressure to get data quickly, to get grants and things like that. And the researchers that I see that do it well have active laboratories, but they also really weigh in heavily on methods and ethics around collaborative research. And so it's taken up a bigger chunk of their career than they would have imagined. And over the course of time, they have communities coming to them as they build trust. But it's not something everybody can or should do. So for those that are willing to have their life hijacked by collaborative methods and ethics, that's great. But one of the other solutions is also to train Indigenous people to do our own science, right? And so, yeah, think really carefully as a student if you want to get involved in that or not.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that I was mostly wondering about was just like for Indigenous communities, like how can more so the students that are within those communities and who live there, you know, how can they keep the research there? Not really from someone like an academic coming in.
Yeah, well, this is the other thing, right? It takes capacity building within the community and communities are spending all of their time and effort on so many other things, right? On getting housing and education going, on defending their land rights. You know, there's a lot of other priorities that might take place over research. So there are methods for doing that, but really it's about scarce resources in communities to do that work. So again, there's a whole literature on that as well. Anyway, there's answers there, but they're not going to be answers that work for everyone. These are too practical of questions for somebody that does theory.
who unfortunately had to leave because of space. That's why I came in last as well. But one of them is on the Dean's List, who's graduating from biology this May 4th. Probably the only Black and Indigenous science student in Dalhousie currently right now. So I want to see him here. I want to make sure, you know, when we talk about futures, that Dalhousie is going to hold him and make sure that there's a space for him. So how would you, I guess, encourage universities to support Black and Indigenous students in the sciences that are like marginalized and then further marginalized because of race?
Well, he should apply to sing, first of all. Right, and come to sing. No matter what the theme is, they always get the professional networking out of it, right? Even if it's not a theme that's really within their area of research. You know, it's interesting. I mostly work with the summer program, right? And it's been really hard for me to actually work with scientific departments, say at U of A. The scientists I work with, I draw from we meet from all over the world, right? Because it's a very particular group of people who want to work on collaborative research and do this kind of work. And so it's not like I can, even at U of A, I have a hard time working with some of the scientific faculties because I'm thinking more about what the barriers are now, right? You know, there's a desire for them to include Indigenous perspectives into their dominant project, but we're not there from the get-go. Really, it comes down to resources. They control the grants, they get the overhead, they have the money, it's distributed according to NSERC guidelines, which do not go to community, right? So I think really what we need to do is, this is a boring answer, but we need to think about tweaking these administrative and financial structures such that there's actually literal material resources going to Indigenous communities. One of the other things I've found is even if there's a desire to include and diversify the lab in the university, Indigenous youth are coming out of communities where they don't have the scientific and math training to even declare these majors in the first place, right? So it needs to start earlier than that. So I think there's a need for addressing those educational deficiencies that come from colonial institutions and colonial education earlier on. But there are no easy fixes within the university. It's really kind of tweaking these structures at every level. So one of the ways I've just found a more satisfying way to work, because I like quicker gratification rather than later gratification, is working with SING, because we see immediate kind of students meet each other, they get excited, they see a room full of other Indigenous students and scientists and people like me, they make those networks, then they go apply usually for a graduate school, working in a lab of somebody who's non-Indigenous, because there's very few Indigenous labs you can work in, but they've already got that network set up such that it helps them stay in science, right? And it helps them think critically about why they're doing that. So I'm not just trying to plug my own program, but it's the space that I've found most inspiring and least, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not discouraging, as I sometimes get discouraged in attempting to work with the Faculty of Science or Engineering at U of A. Not that they don't want to, but they're structurally really hemmed in from doing it well. Yeah. And yes, any other students who are, if you're interested in science or you're interested in science policy or ethics, SING, so you can apply to SING US, you can apply to SING Canada. There's even a couple slots usually to go to New Zealand or Australia, so.
I really appreciate what you had to share today. My name is Ifo. I'm Isoko from the Niger Delta region. The British us.
From where?
The Niger Delta region, West Africa.
Yep.
I was wondering if there's an initiative to connect with African scholars or African scientists, because we have sort of an advantage/disadvantage of being involved in the colonial educational system for longer than the indigenous peoples of this land. We're working to try to fix that, but in the meantime, I think that there is a gap between the indigenous Africans who are in the academy and the indigenous peoples of these lands who are also in the academy. And we're experiencing some similar challenges. But I think that collectively, if we come together, that there's a possibility to support both communities, because I think your communities can teach us more about how to deal with this messed up system called white supremacy. And at the same time, we can also because of for example, in my family, we've got 2 or 3 generations of people who've gone through and been professors. You also have the advantage of having people that have basically gone through what your communities are now going through, since we're dealing with the first generation.
And are you talking about African scientists here or over there?
Both.
Both,
But also here. Like,
Yeah.
my father's retired now, but he used to be,
Yeah,
used to teach here.
when I was involved in conversations with National Institutes of Health around health disparities, there are a lot of African scientists, very interesting, but it's health disparities, right? We have gotten requests, this is interesting to me because I've been paying a lot of attention to Pan-Africanists in social media. So I've been on the Council of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association, and I work in the countries in the world where indigeneity, as complicated as it is in the former British Commonwealth countries, it's still a lot easier than it is in countries across, say, Asia or Africa, right? Indigeneity is more contentious in a lot of countries that are not settler-colonial countries in the same way. So I have video streamed in to give a talk it was actually in South Africa, but there were people from all over the continent there. And I got a lot of blowback for using the word tribe or indigenous. And I was like, I'm talking about the United States. I recognize that these terms don't fly for you over there, right? And that indigeneity doesn't work quite the same way. So this is one of the reasons we're being careful, I think. We are interested, and we've been approached by researchers in South Africa where I think indigeneity works a little bit easier, from my understanding, because it's a settler country in that way, to start a SING over there. But I've been talking to my colleagues in SING globally and saying, yes, we should explore it, but you have to be careful, and we have to make sure that we have people on the ground who understand indigeneity across the continent of Africa. And if we're going to start a program like that, we as North Americans can't come in and be throwing this term around and get ourselves in trouble. So that's the first thing, understanding the geographic politics and the politics there. But yes, I think it is really interesting. And the same thing with the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. I think there's a lot to be talked about. Because there's scientists, if they say they're sampling indigenous people and traditional peoples, and that's the word they use a lot when they're doing sampling around Africa, because indigeneity won't fly. So there is a need to have these conversations, and I think there's a desire. I think the difficulty is the different ways that colonialism has happened on different continents and the different languages that we use today and our different relationships with colonial powers. And we have to be really careful when speaking to one another, right? But yeah, I'm super interested in that, so. Thank you for the question.
I'm a computer scientist, so I will message you.
Okay, great, thank you.
TallBear is definitely on media, so you.
I know, I don't watch TV, I get on Twitter, like when to relax.
Thank you very much. It's not so much a question as just thanking you on behalf of every settler in here for taking the time and having the patience to speak to us in this place.
Thank you. I didn't get any. Thank you.
Okay, now we have even more time.
There was not a single Indigenous Peoples 101 question, which I appreciate, because that's Twitter all day, every day. So thank you.
Okay, so we have gone past the time.
Okay, we're done?
I think
Awesome,
so.
thank you.
Remember, this only just begun. So there's our conversations tomorrow. I did mention that there'll be some room for students tomorrow at 9:30 in the Wilson Common Room. And the big talk tomorrow on decolonial sex and relations for a more sustainable world will be at 3:30 over in the Donche Hall at the Kane building at Dalhousie. A couple of thanks before we do a major thanks, of course, to our partners at College of Sustainability, the elders and residents, Evolution Studies Group, Indigenous Studies, Gender and Women Studies, Philosophy Department, these indefatigable people at the Advancement Office here, my colleagues at King's, of course, and Oriel MacLennan, who supported this endeavor. Our microphone people, Megan Kemper and Alicia sorry. And of course, especially Emily Jocks, who has been our student assistant running around everywhere organizing this. In fact, on behalf of Emily Jocks, myself, and the rest of us at King's, we have a little gift for you.
Oh.
It's a handmade white ash pack basket made especially for you by Frank Muse of the First Nation up in
Oh my
river.
gosh, that's going to have to be my carry-on.
Yeah, it's
huh? Thank you. That's so beautiful.
Let me describe it.
Okay. Wow. Thank you. Does it smell?
So Frank, who's chief and/or councillor for a long time up there, harvests all the ash by himself, by hand, and usually from the reserve. But you know, sometimes from other areas where he's invited to search for good trees, and he writes this to me. It's quite particular about the grain and the feel of the bark, hey? And not too brittle, like when growing near certain other trees. And it has to be knotless 8 feet up, and so on. So once home, he pounds it into splints in his shop, this is his words, weaving the baskets while committed to not using any metal rivets or clasps in his work. So it's all leather and wood.
Beautiful.
And it's a mighty fine pack basket. And this was a mighty fine talk from all of us to all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
We'll pack it off and